Okay. Welcome, and I'm glad you're joining us. As always, we do invite questions, and tonight we're talking about the subject of the supernatural. And the question I posed on the title is just, what about the supernatural? Uh, there's a there's an interesting scripture. It's always kind of stuck out to me, and I'm again, this is kind of from the angle of this kind of, I guess we could call it a series of podcasts we're doing, kind of questioning Christianity, and not necessarily always in some debate form, but just to ask questions that might be common to people thinking about Christianity, or who are presented with the idea of becoming a Christian, and maybe hearing of certain things, and then trying to process that in the world you live in. How does that work? How does that fit into where I am right now, how I already think? Because the truth is, Christianity is by its very nature pretty intrusive. It interrupts your life and forces you to make a decision. That's the nature of Christianity. And so everything we do as a church, evangelism, and I'm not saying that that's an obnoxious thing, and it shouldn't necessarily be an obnoxious thing, but there is clearly an invitation, and then a choice to be made, right? And so when you talk about Christianity, there's a lot of talk in the Bible about a lot of accounts of supernatural things happening. And so there was a scripture that's always stood out to me, that popped into my mind when I was thinking about this topic specifically, and it's God coming to a man named Gideon, and basically telling Gideon, "I've got this plan for your life." And I'm super summarizing the whole thing, but he tells him, "Get up, O man of valor, go in the strength you have I not called you?" And he basically tells Gideon, "I have put you here for a very specific purpose, and you're going to go and do something great for my purpose in the earth." But Gideon turns around and is asking this question, and he says, "Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?" So here's a guy who's living in they're an oppressed people. He's living they're basically oppressed by another tribe, and Israel is not living in any kind of victory or dominion or power. They are the smaller people in this specific time in the Bible, and so being basically ruled and terrorized by another people. And so that's why Gideon's asking this question. He's looking at the world he's living in, and this whole presentation of God coming and speaking to him is like, wait, whoa, how does that fit in this environment? And I was thinking about that because there are a lot of questions, and one of the questions I'll kind of ask tonight about, you know, evil in the world, and when you look at the political environment and the social environment, the amount of division and the amount of argument and fight and all that, and it could just be that stuff is much more publicized now because of the access to media and cameras everywhere, and everybody being able to record and send out messages, and social media and all that stuff makes it more apparent instead of new. It's not necessarily new or unique, or that's how the world is today as opposed to 60 years ago. But the one thing you can say with confidence is that when people are presented with this idea of a God who can save and do miracles and heal and cleanse and deliver people, and it's when you try to fit that into the world we live in, there could be this question of, okay, how does that fit? How does that work? And how come I'm not seeing that happen like the Bible accounts it? And so there's a lot in what I just said. And so I guess the kind of main questions are, you know, could we ask the same question about today? And, you know, where is God in all this is kind of the big question. Where is the God who can overcome evil? And where is the God who can deliver? And where is the God that can heal, situations or people that, doctors say have no hope, and stuff like that. And so, again, this is from that angle, asking these questions. But let's just start right. Well, before I go any further, maybe you have comments or anything that you want to just, say there? Because I know how your mind works. I start saying something, your mind's rolling a million miles an hour. So,
Well, the thought that came to my mind was just because you're talking about Gideon, which is in the book of Judges, and how the book of Judges introduces us to that period of time. It says that everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. And so it's a period of time where everybody's doing what they want to do. And God's nowhere to be found. And so we could ask the question, where is God? But I think if you come from the standpoint of God, it's really, where are you?
yeah.
And that I think that answers the question where God is where are you? Somewhere else. And that really is the issue. And all the things that you mentioned about the world and things that are going on in the world is because we have gone somewhere else. It just happens to be that we're stuck on this planet. We can't go anywhere else. And so we're stuck on this planet, but God isn't. He isn't stuck on this planet. He isn't stuck hanging out with humans. He lives in heaven, and there are scriptures all through the Bible of God and the majesty of God and the worship of God in heaven and angels, and there's a whole going on. And I think probably the better way to look at this is probably that there's a party going on in heaven, and here on earth everybody's sitting on their couch wishing there was something to do. It's probably the better way of putting things in its proper perspective, rather than worrying where God is. The question really is, how come we don't want to be at the party? And that really is the issue when it comes right down to it, and is the lack of interest on the behalf of mankind is a direct reflection of God's involvement, his supernatural involvement in lives, because he's come at specific times and specific moments of visitation. Even in recent times, there's been what's referred to as revivals in the 17 and 1800s, even as early as or recent, I should say, of the 1900s, 1960s, 70s. With the Jesus People movement. And so it's not like God hasn't been around. He's always been around, and he's been more active than at other times, but his inactivity is really probably better described as the time of mankind's least concern about God and God's involvement. And so, it's directly related to the supernatural. God's supernatural intervention is relative to the desire of mankind for God to supernaturally intervene. Just go get it.
That's hilarious. Excuse the interruption. That's pretty funny. Wrong TV. All right. Sorry. I'm get myself situated here. Okay. So it's interesting that you say it in the context of the book of Judges, because the book of Judges...
well, that's what you were reading.
Yeah, I know, but it's funny that you zoomed out and just kind of looked at the whole thing, because the book of Judges takes place around a 325-year period. Mm-hmm. It's like a really long span of time. Yeah. But in that time frame, if you do your own, for time's sake, I won't go on all into it, but there were, like you said, God comes at these specific times, these specific moments. Even in Gideon's situation, he came and, clearly this is a supernatural conversation that's happening right now.
Yeah.
But the response is what was...
Yeah, well, it's a moment where God is doing what he wants to do, in the earth, mm-hmm. And it isn't, God isn't constantly doing things, and it is funny, to me, the whole approach that most that where many people take to God is the idea of God, serving us, and he created us. It's the classic spoiled, rotten child. If
Yeah.
you've ever seen a child, and there has been on the occasion where that child has no respect for its parents whatsoever, and it just all it sees is that its parents are not doing enough, to accommodate all their desires. And it's the same thing, when humans want to question and say things negatively about God. Where is he? Why isn't he here? And why are things the way they are? Why is there suffering in the world? All this kind of stuff. It's just classic spoiled, rotten, childish behavior. It's as simple as that. Because there's nothing written anywhere that God guaranteed that anybody was going to have a great life. He didn't, there was no precondition. Okay, before you create me, let's talk about this, and decide whether or not I want to be created. It's just not that, there's not, no, there's no, respect, basically for who God is in those kinds of questions, because those kind of questions have an expectation from God, that God ought to do certain things. And people say, well, if I was God, I would do those things. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. You say that because you can't. It's like the have you ever talked to a homeless person, and they get on the conversation of money and what they would do if they had money, how liberal they'd be, the things they would buy, how many people they would help, all the things that they would do. Well, that's why you don't have any money, because you don't have any understanding of how money works. It's not that you're just more charitable than everybody else. It's just that there are limitations, as to what money can do, and how money works. And the idea of God and who God is. If I was an infant and I could do anything and I could be anywhere, and I could help everybody, and I would just do it. No, you wouldn't. You say that, but you wouldn't. How long would you be? If you did that, if you had that opportunity, the reality is nobody would pay attention to you. Nobody even talk about you. It'd be like, you'd only be noticed when you were gone.
So let's start at the basics. What really is the supernatural? Like, when we're talking about the supernatural, everything we just talked about is more from the positive, but the supernatural obviously covers a lot more than just miracles being done on, our behalf.
Yeah, well, the supernatural is what God does. That's the bottom line. It is who God is and what He does when He gets involved in things. That's why He can just jump into the middle of time at any particular moment, and He can change whatever's going on. And that is the history that we see in the Bible of God jumping in at various times throughout human history, and changing everything, and bringing this awareness, to humanity of His existence and His involvement. And then there's a period of time where there's space where God isn't doing that, and people are drifting away. And that's the interesting thing to me about the Bible, is these are, quote, God's chosen people, but yet they have the opportunity to be with God every day. But yet the reality is they don't want to be with God every day. They want to do other things. They want to do things that are disobedient. They want to sin. One of the things that happens over and over and over again is the godly men going after the ungodly women. And that just happens again and again and again and again and again. And it's just we would much rather have our own personal pleasure than to live forever in eternity and have a relationship with God. And that's just the reality of how we function. And salvation is only for those who are not interested in that anymore. They're actually interested in a relationship with God. And so then God does a miracle and he saves them and they become new people and they are able to do things that other people are not able to do. And that is why you see the, sort of ebbs and flows of the supernatural happening, is because God's not always involved in things. I was praying for a guy the other day, and he's had problems with his shoulder, and he is wearing this brace. I asked him if he believed in miracles. Yeah, and so then I talked to him a little bit, and I said I want to pray for you, and so I started to pray for him, and a little bit better, but not significantly. And then I asked him, I said, how long have you been like this? And he said, for a year. I said, you haven't been working for a year? And he said, yeah. And I thought, that's why you're not getting healed.
Yeah. Doesn't want to get healed.
You don't want to get healed, because I was a little bit confused at first. I was like, there's not anything really happening. And then I realized he doesn't want to be healed. I'm praying for somebody who doesn't want healing, And so it's like, what's there to expect?
So, do you think Christians, or maybe you would just say religion in general, overemphasizes the supernatural?
No, I would say it probably underemphasizes it more than overemphasizes
Expected
it.
you to say that. Why?
Well,
Why does
because
it underemphasize it?
well, because supernatural is proof that God exists, but we like to play games, and that really is what it comes down to. Is we like to play games. We like to pretend God's real when it suits us, and that maybe He's not real when it doesn't. Or maybe Christianity isn't the way. Maybe something else is the way, and so I'm going to go sin for a while, and then we'll see what happens, and then of course, things start caving in, and then okay, oh yeah, no, Jesus is real. I'm, and then 6 months later back it's a cycle.
What do you think Christians should do as far as concerning the supernatural? Like how should Christians be living?
How should they be living?
Yeah, like what is the correct emphasis?
Well, living, it's funny. You read through the sermon that I did last Sunday, I think, last Sunday morning, talking about the idea of what is Christianity, and Christianity, at the end of the day, it's a supernatural life. A real Christian is somebody who lives supernaturally. Yeah, they aren't driven by the same things that everybody else is driven by, and it's just funny because I was reading because I'm doing this series on thinking biblically, and came across a handful of other scriptures even after I did that sermon, having to do with the idea of that the bottom line is that Christians don't sin. The idea of living, when the Bible talks about sinning, it's talking about the practice of sin. Christians don't do that. Christians don't have a habit of sin. They don't practice sin. They're not things in their life. It's like smoking, oh, it's okay to be a Christian and still smoke. No, it's a sin. Drinking is a sin, and anything having to do with drugs or alcohol, any kind of drug whatsoever, it doesn't matter what it is that when that drug is having influence on your life, you have to stop and ask yourself the question, why do you need it? Why do you need the drug in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I need to relax, I need to calm down, I need to unwind, I'm stressed out, I got this, I got that, I got the other thing. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you that you're ignoring God. Because that's why you have those things. That's why people stress out. That's why all these things happen, because God's the solution to those things. He's the answer to those things. You get delivered from stress. You get delivered from the need for drugs. You get delivered from all of that by becoming a Christian. And so the idea of you still need those things, but you're a Christian. Well, no, you're not. You're only a Christian in name, but not in reality.
So tell me about, because we talked about, I don't know, a week ago or so, we talked about something you referred to as the God factor. And you were referring to yourself in, the first time when you actually became a Christian, and something that was happening in you that kind of superseded what your friend was, or, the guy that was kind of introduced or inviting you to church was telling you. And so, would you say that was your first, like, encounter with the supernatural?
Okay. There's when I roll back through my life, there have been moments that I will call supernatural. They were unexplainable moments. There wasn't a lot of them, but each one of those moments was definitely a God encounter moment. It wasn't just, hey, that was weird, who was that? It was like, this is God. It was almost like it was like God passing me his business card.
Did you think that at the time?
Yes. Yeah. I didn't have any details on it because I didn't know anything about Christianity at the time. But I remember very, very specifically being, at a party and things going very, very bad at the party, and a friend of mine starting a fight with some guys who were at the party who wanted and were looking for a fight, and he nearly got killed, and they had to rush him to the hospital, and there was a whole thing around that. But I couldn't get my car to start. This short story, I couldn't get my car to start, and so they helped me get my car started. And it was like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. They want to kill us. They're telling us we better get out of here right now, or this guy, because they're holding this guy back. He's going to kill us, and so, and then I told them I couldn't get my car started. I needed a push, and they gave me a push. They all got behind and gave me a push, and it was, so that was one. And then the second one was a time where I was drinking. I had been drinking a lot, and I was racing, and I hadn't realized that it was a dead end street, and I was at full speed going along, and I see that it's a dead end, and there's nothing I can do about it. There's a wall that's a retaining wall about 2 feet tall. Hit it full speed, took out the whole bottom of my car. Both my wheels got smashed back up into almost to the driver's compartment. And I felt myself going forward, and it was all of a sudden, it was like, I was going at a certain speed, and then I just kind of stopped and then tapped the steering wheel. And I thought that was weird. And then the final time was when I ended up becoming a Christian, is that this friend of mine had prayed for me. And when he prayed for me, I felt, being spoken to. At the time I didn't think of it as God. Well, I did kind of think of it as God, but I didn't, like I said, I didn't have details on it, to go with him to church. I mean, obviously it wouldn't be me or something else, telling me to go to church, because I didn't want to go, and I told him I didn't want to go, and I had been telling him I didn't want to go. And so those were the three moments where I knew that God was, like I said, he was handing me his business card. He was showing me, and there were supernatural occurrences that were associated with that. And so that night, when I went to church, and then I became a Christian that night, I made a kind of a bargain with God that I would give him my entire life if he would show me that he was real. And that's what happened, is that I knew for a fact that God was real, because the next day when I got up, I was a completely different person. Now, that wasn't the same kind of a thing, because there was nothing weird that happened from the standpoint of a single thing. It was like all of a sudden my whole life is different. And so I just knew at that moment, that I wasn't the same person. And I knew that had something to do with the prayer last night, and I knew that had something to do with God. But it was more third person than the other two or other three times. The other three times were very personal. They were very close up and face to face, where this was more of a, hey, I'm different. I'm not the same person anymore. And so that was the beginning. Those were the supernatural moments that I had, before I became a Christian. And then after that, I've had, many, many moments similar to those.
What would you say are some of the most significant times?
When God told me that Mariah, who's now my wife, was going to get saved, I knew in March, God literally spoke to me in March, that she was going to get saved, and that we were going to get married. she was living in another state. I was living in Arizona. She was living in California, and we didn't even hardly know each other to begin with. We'd probably seen each other 2 or 3 times beforehand at parties. She was more my brother's a year and a half younger than me, and so is my wife, and she was more that group, hanging out of that group, because we were young then. We were in our teens and 20s, and so being a year and a half younger was a long time. It was like the difference between I'm 19, she's 17 going on 18, and so it's like I'm on another, and that was 19 was a drinking age, so you could go legally going to nightclubs at the time, and so that was a
You
whole.
were just like an adult compared to her then.
Well, I was from what I could do,
yeah.
compared to her. And so, but
I know exactly what you're referring
yeah,
to. As well.
but so I'm going to clubs with older people. I'm like the youngest of the people going to the clubs, right? Because I'm at the lower level.
Yeah.
But they can't go without sneaking in. They've got to sneak in and stuff like that. So their partying was mostly at houses, at people's houses, and so I went to the clubs, and then they had their house parties, and I would go occasionally to the house parties when I would just get bored of the club scene. But but I knew she was going to get saved, and she did. She ended up in July. July. She got saved, and so that's 2 months before she got saved. I knew she was going to get saved, and then and then there's a whole story behind that, but that's neither here nor there. And then we ended up getting married in March of the following year. And so, but I knew these things were going to happen, and it wasn't so much that I was looking forward to these or doing things to try to make those things happen, because they were more thoughts that were like, cool, okay, kind of thoughts. It wasn't, hearing from God, and that this is one of the things that I should, I know I'm gonna, a lot of YouTubers are going to be very disappointed, but hearing from God isn't this thing where you just absolutely know that it's God. And you see this from the Bible. You see people in the Bible that even in having conversations with angels, they're not sure 100% exactly if what's happening is really happening the way that it's happening.
Actually, Gideon
they say,
goes through a whole process of, can you just prove that this is actually
yeah. And Abraham and others, they did the same thing. Okay, so if this is what you want to do, then do this, and do that, or do the other thing. And there's like these little testing moments, because it isn't 100% clarity, because God is speaking to us in the same way that we have thoughts. And so is it our thoughts, or is it God speaking to us? And so I don't rely on those things, and I never have. I've never relied, God's speaking to me, and I've there's been full on conversations that have been going on in my head, and I've absolutely said, there is no way this is God. This is too solid. This is too full, too familiar. I hear every word. I know what's going on. There's no way this can be God speaking to me. And it turns out to actually be, it's a full on, not a conversation even, more like a it's like God just ordaining something. It's like, just this is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and the other thing, and this is going to work out like this, and it's very very but very, it's like, wow, that's very detailed, and it's like a proclamation. That was the word I was looking for, like a proclamation from God.
So
and those are the times, huh?
I was going to say pep talk.
No, because it was more like God just saying, thus saith the Lord, kind of a thing to me. But it was like, why are you sharing all this with me? I mean, this is a lot of information. Why are you telling me, like this particular moment that I'm thinking of is, I'm going to get a job, and how I'm going to get the job, how it's going to play out, how this is all going to work out. And what I need to do with this current job, and blah, blah, blah. And so there was, I would say it wasn't a long period of time, but it was a good 5 minutes, 5 minutes of God just talking and things that I needed to do, because I'm like, what do I do with this, information? And so and then it all happened literally the exact way that it was described, which is, for me, that's just evidence of the truth of God, is that, because there's no way these things could have happened otherwise. Is they were definitely supernatural experiences.
So interesting that I was trying to pick up on a bit of a pattern and just try and, you know, gear this in a direction. I'll be honest with you, this is a bit more of a comparisons type thing. So like coming from the perspective of people who don't experience or see or notice the supernatural versus somebody who does. And so everything you just talked about, even in your comments about Gideon in the book of Judges, it sounds like the difference was how people responded to situations or things that happened, right? How you responded in the beginning of, with the situation with the car, the situation with the party. It was like there was a consciousness that you're thinking that wasn't normal. That was,
Yeah.
something was different there.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I said about the business card thing is that it was like hello, this is God trying to get your attention. That's what it was like. And it wasn't without those words. It was just like the fight, because I prayed, I mean, I really did think we were going to be killed that night.
When you were in the car.
Yeah. I prayed for my life, because I really did think that was it. I thought it was,
What did you say? What did you pray?
I just said, God, I need you to help me. And
God did. What would inspire you to do that?
Well, because I knew that nobody else could help me. Because
Did you believe in God at that point?
That's a hard question to answer because I don't know what that means. In that moment, moment, I don't know what that means. I just know, that at that moment, I had no other resources because I couldn't start the car. I knew why I couldn't start the car. There was an actual mechanical failure with the car that would require me to get out of the car, open the hood of the car, turn the fan belt so that the starter drive would be disengaged. And then I could get back in and start. It's an automatic car. I'm not going to be able to drive this. They're pushing it. It's not going to make a blind bit of difference. And so this has to happen. And so I'm just kind of, sitting in the car. And I'm thinking, these guys could easily smash the windows and get at us if they wanted to, and they're not. And I'm not exactly sure what's restraining them, because if you could see what I saw, when I got in the car, because we were just, they were yelling and calling us names and stuff like that. I just got in the car. My friend got out of the car and went over to talk to the guy who was the chief name caller, and he just clobbered him. He just clocked him. And he crumpled, like it was like his spirit left his body. It's the only way. It was like all of a sudden, if somebody disappeared and their clothes just fell on the ground, that's what it would be like. And I thought, oh, these guys are serious. They're planning. They don't care. They're too drunk to understand how dangerous they are. And I knew, they were gonna do us, and he again, miraculously, he got up and ran over, and as he was running over, this guy came back at him again, flying after him, because his friends had pulled him off after he knocked him out, because he was just going to start. Fortunately, because it's very different now, but back then, you didn't kick somebody when they were down. Okay, you're down, you're out. There was no honor in kicking an unconscious body like today. Today it's a real it's a very, very dishonorable generation. Let's just put it that way. That gets into fights now. And
Sounds like you're kind of going somewhere with that.
Well, I know. It was. I was laughing because it's a phrase that my dad used to say. It's called chicken poop. But and he used to call that people who do that, people who fight like that, because they can't fight a real fight. They have to jump in when the person's unconscious and kick at them and stuff like that, because they're not fighters. But anyway, so the whole thought that night was, it's over. I'm gonna die. So it's like, it's what's left. When you have nothing left, who do you talk to? Kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Is God. And so I would say that, I would say yes, I had a belief in God, but only because I didn't have a reason not to. I didn't have a reason not to believe in God. There was there was a world around me of miraculous stuff. People, people are miraculous. I mean, there's, people are not animals, and animals are miraculous. And plants are miraculous. I mean, all of this is miraculous. It's not, the idea of, of trying to dissolve everything down to, that evolution, everything started with nothing and came together and became something. It ignores the very singular factor, and most important factor is life itself. Just the idea of life, that there is a such thing as life. We can't come anywhere near life, not in the real sense. AI does a great job at emulating life, pretending to be a living organism, but it's not a living organism, and it never will be, and we will never create life. That's this idea that life is built from building blocks, and that you put it together and then all of a sudden life happens. It's just not true. We don't even have any evidence to substantiate such a claim, but we just say it anyway. Oh, no, because, there are proteins and this is and that's another thing. You say, if we could just put those things together the right way, then we would create life. And it's like, we're nowhere near creating life. Nowhere even close to creating life. It's not just a few peptides, and we got this. It's just not. That's just not life. And we had a few seconds of life in a test tube, by doing a certain kind of an experiment. No, you haven't. No, you had a chemical reaction, but not life. Life is different. Life is not. It's not that. Have you ever seen what can happen to a human being? You can get hit by a car and thrown in the air and roll around on the street and still be alive. I mean, you can take a heck of a lot and still be alive. You can have almost every part of your body removed, and still be alive. You can have your arms and legs torn off and your eyes pulled out and your ears and nose pulled out and your jaw broken off and still be alive. I mean, you can go without a lot of stuff, so it's like, there's still life, and then the amazing thing is somebody who's in that kind of a state, who's had, the snot beat out of them or have had some tragedy in life, and then turn around and say life's still worth living. It's like, well, that's a whole another level. You can't do hardly anything that normal human beings can do, but yet you still want to be alive. Why is that? Because life is more than doing things.
So what is the difference between a person who experiences the supernatural and somebody who doesn't? Like, what is the real difference?
I think everybody experiences the supernatural. Some people, there's I would say several levels to this, but there are people who the supernatural ruins their ability to be an influencer, and so they can't tie into the supernatural, even though they've experienced it.
What do you mean by that? Be an influencer?
People, other people look at, and take notice of, and idolize, and that's, I've talked about it before. Richard Dawkins he's famous for being an atheist, and he's a biologist, but he's famous for being an atheist. He's well known. If anybody knows Richard Dawkins, if they know who he is, they know, oh, he's that atheist guy. Not, oh, he's the biologist and he's done, amazing things for biology. No, he just rehashes everything that biology has always been. He's not bringing anything new to the table. Because he's known for his atheism. And so, so for him, for somebody like that to acknowledge the supernatural, well, now what do? You're just a biologist like all the rest of them biologists, kind of a thing. You're not even a like an amazing biologist. You're just like a no-name biologist. If you don't have, if you say, you give into the supernatural. See, for somebody like Richard Dawkins, if he became a Christian, a real genuine Christian, would probably go into oblivion. Nobody would even think of him again, other than the fact that he's an ex-atheist. That would be the only thing to keep him, going, would be the fact that he was an ex-atheist. But other than that, there still wouldn't be, so he would be known by a few Christians, and that would be it.
So what about like the layers? You mentioned, there are many layers to this. What would you say are the layers? What were you thinking when you said
Oh, other layers. Well, some people don't. It's funny because this is a sort of evolving concept in my thinking, but more and more I'm of the opinion that there are people that they don't want to have anything to do with God. It's not a question of whether or not God's real. God is absolutely real, and they absolutely know God's real, but they're not going to acknowledge him because they want, foolishly and naively, they want to live independent of God. And so they feel that if they don't believe in him, then they can live independently of God. There are people that, over the years that I've watched, the kinds of decisions that they make, and it's like, listen, let's face the facts here. You don't want to have a relationship with God. It's as simple as that. So just stop coming to church. Stop coming back. Stop playing the game. You're just hoping that you can check in, long enough to get to heaven, maybe, and somehow that there's going to be some sort of loophole that you're going to grab a hold of and be able to be saved while you're living independently, and that is a big factor as well. I think is that there are people that's their approach to God, is that they want to do what they want to do, and God is only in the picture because he's real, and they know he's real, but they would prefer to not even really pay any attention to him.
So again, thinking about this whole idea of a pattern, it sounds a lot like there is a big difference in how people respond to the supernatural that dictates how things continue.
Well, because there's supernatural all around us. It's not like there is no supernatural. We're surrounded by supernatural all the time. The fact that we still, if we didn't have a part of our brain that works independently of us, we wouldn't even be alive. There's a part of us that says breathe, 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 and it's constantly happening. The heart is constantly beating because of some other reason than our conscious efforts to keep our heart beating. Like I said, you can get blasted in a horrible accident and still survive and then recover. You read about like Civil War. Civil War is brutal, absolutely brutal. The kind of weapon where you think about it, they're firing 1,000-pound balls of metal at each other. It's like this is if you get hit by one of those, and people have, and they had legs and arms torn off of their bodies by these things. Not like now where, you go into war and you get shot or whatever, and, and you've got a wound and it needs to be bandaged up. No, it's gone. The limb is on its way still, 100 miles an hour, still making its way down the field, you're never to be seen again. But yeah, but there's so much supernatural that is surrounding us. There's no. I don't believe in miracles. Science cannot accept miracles because miracles don't work with science, and that's just foolish. It's just plain foolish, because what you're saying is you're going to limit science by ignoring supernatural events, because they're happening all the time. How are you going to get anywhere? Why is it taking so long for us to, advance in so many areas of life? Something is, funny though. It used to be a conspiracy. There must be better batteries. than there are, because it must just be these companies are just sitting on the technology, and then all of a sudden we have this desperate need for portable power, batteries or something equivalent to a battery, and we're struggling like crazy trying to find something different. Why? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to harness energy. We're trying to collect energy and put it into a container, you know, because energy is supernatural. We don't know how to make energy. We don't know how to do that. We only know how to capture energy, and we've learned principles about energy that we can, solar, so energy can be converted into different forms. And so here's this big sun, this thing that happened accidentally, that is running our world. It's running our world. That, for billions of years and cataclysmic events, and just happen to have this experience, and just happens to just give off tons and tons and tons of energy, that we can just, that we can take these little, little boxes, little mirror looking box things, and we can point it out there, and then we can connect the battery to it, and we can charge batteries, and science can't see how valuable that is, and how that process works, and how critical it is if we're going to move forward as a society to understand the dynamics of the natural energy sources, that we have, that and we have to live in this world where people have to say. It's funny to me because all the limitations that evolutionists put on Christians. Oh, if you're a Christian, then you don't think like this, and you don't think like that, and you don't think this way, and you don't do this, and you're not into science, and you're not into this, and you're not into that, and the other thing. The reality is the reverse is true. Is that true Christians, true biblically thinking Christians, have a far greater understanding of science than non-Christians. I mean, it is that simple. Because as a non-Christian, you have to ignore so many things, and say that these can't be part of science, in order to be able to make your little ideas work. And so we'll never make any progress like that. As long as everything has to happen your way, your little human scientist way, and not God supernatural way. So much, is involved in this.
So now, tell me about the difference between people who have experienced the supernatural and those who are regularly benefiting it from it.
Well, like I said, they're supernatural all the time. The
not
the
generally,
benefit, yeah, the benefit of the supernatural is very easy, to appropriate, because all you have to do is acknowledge the God who's behind the supernatural, and it's not a religious God, it's not a God from the Greeks or the Romans, or the Norse, or any of those, and it's not the quote major religions of the world, Islam, Judaism, and or what probably is better described as Judeo-Christianity. These are not, they're not, the religions are not, they're not the pathway. The pathway is God himself, who he is, and how he's manifested himself, and that is demonstrated in the Bible. And the Bible is far more than just Judeo-Christianity. It's far more than that.
So what? I mean, other than but you're talking about like acknowledging God in what way? What makes a man acknowledge God, or what qualifies acknowledging God?
Well, that you there's a song is God is God and I am not. I mean that has to be the first step, is to realize how small you are. I remember so vividly the night that I prayed, and this was a genuine prayer to God. And it was, I was not, arms folded, spoiled brat, like I said, spoiled, rotten child, what have you ever done for me, or anything like that. It wasn't any of that. It's, if you're real, I want to know you. I want to know you, and I know that I'm not God like. I'm not even close. I'm making a very, a very, you know, challenging, you know, statement. I want to know you. What is that going to look like? What is that going to mean? How in the world can I know God? It's funny. You listen to some of the things that over the years that Jordan Peterson has said. He really does hit the nail on the head. He's kind of dancing all over it. I know now, but way back, I live as if God exists. And the reason is because he has a fear of if God exists. And that's such a revolutionary concept. Because usually you have a fear of God because you know he exists, or you don't care about God because he doesn't exist as far as you're concerned. But to have that kind of a posture that says, I fear God because the possibility is a fearful thing, and I don't want to be on the wrong side of this argument. And so I see things like that, and I think, is more and more, there's a guy, he's a YouTube guy, and he says he's agnostic. He seems to be more, I'd say more a really nice anti-theist than anything. But he has this conversation with ChatGPT and gets ChatGPT to admit that there is in fact a God. ChatGPT says, yes, in fact, there is a God. Based on our conversation, in fact, God exists, because he's talking about the idea of things and their existence, and getting their verification from something else, that there are certain things that get their existence from other things. And the difference between absolute, what was it, how did he say, absolute existence, and that these aren't the right words, he used something else, conferred existence or something like that. In other words, like a microphone can't self-exist. There has to have been somebody to have made the microphone. And so, the microphone is on the stand is on the table's on the ground is on the foundation of the building is on the earth, and it keeps going back and back and back. And so everything gets its support or its existence from something else, and it can be at some point everything goes back to self. There has to be a self-existent thing somewhere. At some point everything goes back to self-existence, and so that self-existence has to be a self-existent being, because a microphone cannot be created by another piece of machinery. Another piece of machinery can be made to make a microphone, but somebody had to make that machinery. And so you keep going back, because there's always further back to go. Whether it's inanimate objects or organic, it doesn't matter. At some point, there's always got to be something that came before, something came before. But everything comes to that place where it has to be, the question has to be answered: what is the thing that's self-existent? There has to be. There just has to be. Whether self-existence can, which I think it's laughable. It's so silly. It's like the emperor's new clothes kind of thing, is that to say that everything began from nothing and nothing has been here forever. And it's like, seriously? Nothing, nothing doesn't exist. There's no such thing as nothing. It literally means no thing. And so to try to come up with this philosophy, or even trying to be scientific about it, and what about dark matter? And yeah, you're still talking about something. You're not talking about nothing, no thing. And it all comes back to that, is there has to be a God. There has to be, and so if you will acknowledge that, now you're in a position to where that you can begin to approach God. And now the next thing that has to happen is God is bigger than you are, and until you're willing to do that. And that really is what comes down to is if you look at, most, especially any vocal atheists, and I would say without exception, vocal atheists always have to belittle Christianity. They can't just deal with it from a factual point of view.
Yeah.
They always have to belittle
yeah.
it. It's a
I've noticed that.
requirement. It's a necessity to their personality, to their existence, that they have to belittle it. They can't just leave it alone. They have to belittle it. And what does that tell you? You're trying to not think about something. You're actively trying not to think about something. And so you do that by belittling, ignoring, pretending it doesn't exist. But you have to do it consciously. It's like the whole classic, red-faced monkeys. You can't stop thinking about red-faced monkeys by saying, I'm not going to think about red-faced monkeys. You are going to think about red-faced monkeys as long as the term red-faced monkeys is floating around in your thinking. You're not going to not think about it until it goes away completely, and you stop the idea of red-faced monkeys. And it's the same thing when it comes to God. It's the same idea as you have to just not, he has to not exist for you to not think about him. And so that's the problem, is that he does exist, and so you do have to think about him. You may be able to get away with a period of time without thinking about God, but you will come back to the subject at some point, because he exists.
Okay, last question. Now, you've kind of walked up to a certain point in your answer just now, but how did that perpetuate in your life to where you weren't just experiencing the supernatural, but you're living supernaturally?
Well, like I said, that day that I became a Christian, that day that I prayed, that night that I prayed and I said, God, if you're real, make yourself real to me. And the next day I was not the same person. There was a surrender as to the way I would describe it is it was a surrender to the fullest extent that it is possible to surrender to something you're not sure of. And it was sufficient for God to do it, to work in me, I could say do a miracle, but to do miracles would probably be a better way of describing it, because it was a multitude of things. It wasn't just one thing. It's a multitude of things. It could be, you could call it a multifaceted miracle, but it was definitely more than just a thing. It wasn't just a concept, but over the years, I've had to, learn how to communicate to people. Chris, the kind of changes that happen in my life don't happen. They just don't happen in the world that we live in. They just don't. Show me somebody who does, and I always say that. You show me somebody who's done that, and they'll go, "Oh, I know somebody who doesn't cuss." It's like, yeah, that's not what I said. I said, show me somebody who doesn't do any of the things, that I just stopped doing in a day altogether. I know people who don't drink. I know people who don't do drugs. Well, do you know people who don't drink, don't do drugs, don't have sex outside of marriage, and don't cuss? I mean, just give me one of those just to start with, and then once you've given me that person, I can add on 50 more things, that are also things that I used to do that I stopped immediately doing the next day, and that's what we're talking about. That's why I said multifaceted. It's so many different levels of things that happen. But it begins with that. It has to begin with that ability to, and I will say to anybody who's watching this, who claims to be a Christian, you have to be honest with yourself. If you haven't made that kind of surrender that I just described, if you haven't made that, now I'm not talking about perfection, I'm not talking about screwing up, I'm not talking about having times where you do something stupid and you think, God, that was stupid, and you stop doing it. It's not a habit of your life. If you still have practices of things like swearing or drinking or smoking or having sex outside of marriage or anger, or all the other things that go with the deliverance that happens as a Christian, you know, then you have that. I think it would be worthwhile to investigate, because you may not be a Christian. You may only think you are, but you may not actually be one. Because especially if you don't have a problem with those things, people who don't have a problem with drinking, don't have a problem with swearing, don't have a problem with smoking and taking drugs and having sex outside of marriage. People who don't have a problem with those things, that's called unregenerate. It's not called people who found the grace of God. That's people who they have found the way to turn off their conscience, and that's what they are. They've actually gone the other way. They're farther away from God than they could ever be, because they don't actually even have enough of a conscience to have a distaste for the things that God very clearly dislikes, that are obviously, biblically speaking, obviously God dislikes.
Well, that's all I have for tonight. I hope that was at least helpful. And my hope is that this would go in a direction that would at least cause people to think. And I mentioned that last
Yeah.
week. And so I hope that that's at least caused you to think about, your own position when it comes to the supernatural. And one of the interesting things that you kind of mentioned, and you see it all through the Bible, is that the supernatural kept happening to people who kept responding to the supernatural.
Yeah.
It's like almost like regularly the supernatural was initiated by God saying do something, and then there was a follow up to that, a response
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah, and supernatural, when it is not always, not always personally beneficial. Supernatural sometimes can simply be, like I mentioned about people that, I've had, terrible accidents or terrible life experiences, but yet they still have a joy. They still have a reason to live. That's still supernatural. And that's still, and it may be beneficial to them, and I'm not discounting the idea that there isn't some benefit associated with it, but it doesn't make all your problems go away. And that, I think, is the most important thing, is that there's an ability, part of the understanding of the supernatural is that there's also a supernatural ability to be able to endure things that many would consider to be unendurable. It would be impossible to endure those things, but yet it can be done, and that is equally as supernatural and amazing, as anything else. Whether it's a direct answer to prayer, or like Paul says, when he prayed about this thorn, God's grace enabled him to be able to deal with that issue in his life. So
Yeah. Very cool. All right. Well, we will be here again next week, and we are obviously at a church. We are a church, and so if you're joining us for the first time, if you're in the local area, you're in the San Carlos or the Peninsula area, or even in some part of the Bay Area close by, we invite you to come join us at our midweek service tomorrow night. And it starts at 7 o'clock. We are also having a live concert this Saturday, and so that's also going to be here at the church, and that starts at 7:30. That's Saturday night. We invite you to come be a part of that live and in person. And again, we'll be here next week. Thanks for joining.